Welcome, listeners, to www.ironradio.org, the website and podcast for all things strength sports and sports nutrition. With your hosts, Lonnie Lowry.
Remember, Phil is like a gnarled old oak tree held together with scar tissue and bone spurs.
Rob Fortney.
And I'm telling you, the pain that I would suffer was beyond excruciating.
And Phil Stevens.
Do it, Rob. You'll kill all those nerves.
Thanks for listening. Welcome, Iron Radio listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry. I'm an exercise physiology and sports nutrition professor of about 20 years, and I'm a former competitive bodybuilder.
And this is Phil Stevens. I run Strength Guild. I'm a strength coach. I'm also a powerlifter and Highland Games athlete.
This is Dr. Mike T. Nelson. I'm owner of Extreme Human Performance, creator of the Flex Diet Cert, and still here in Hood River, Oregon, where I rode almost 50 miles on my kiteboard yesterday.
Wow.
So I'm a little sore.
Well, I hope that soreness goes away. This is Sara Campbell. I am an associate professor of kinesiology and health at Rutgers University, and my area of expertise is the gut microbiota and how it's influenced by diet and exercise.
Awesome.
Hey.
Yep. We are going to cover just one little tidbit of news today, everybody, because we want to get to Dr. Campbell's origin story. And then the topic of the day, which, as you might guess, is gut health, right, and the microbiome and what it might do for strength athletes and that sort of thing. But let's get to this little tidbit of news here. It's very thematic.
Strength and muscle sport news.
This is by Celeste Alexander and colleagues. It's in the new edition, the new issue of Advances in Nutrition. It's just entitled Perspective, Physiologic Importance of Short-Chain Fatty Acids from Non-Digestible Carbohydrate Fermentation. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it sets the stage by saying that in recent years it's become increasingly obvious that dietary fiber or non-digestible carbohydrate consumption is critical for maintaining health, right, and affecting your metabolism. So much so that in 2016, the FDA actually took it upon themselves to define, or at least define a little bit better, what fiber is. And so just to kind of explain a little bit of this, the paper also goes on to talk about how it's essentially the breakdown or the partial breakdown of these fibers, right, by your gut microbiota, and some of the products of that then can have farther reaching effects on your everything from mood to metabolism, etc., including these short-chain fatty acids. And again, we're going to get educated by Dr. Campbell on this in just a little bit. But it basically says in this review, we discussed the physiologic importance of non-digestible carb fermentation by examining the evidence. And again, they're really focusing on maybe more emphasis on the endpoint of these short-chain fatty acids as something that really needs to be looked at closely. In the intro to the paper here, just as I crack this open, it talks about how the FDA actually listed 15 isolated and synthetic non-digestible carbohydrates that could have beneficial physiologic effects. So here are some that you may be familiar with. Cellulose, pectin, right? So think like fruit pectin, guar gum, locust bean gum. You might see that as a thickener in foods like ice cream, for example. Beta-glucan, psyllium husk, inulin, which I believe is often derived from chicory root, but corn fiber, resistant starch. Corn fiber, I think that's what's in Quest bars, if I remember right.
Yeah, they used it for a while. I don't know if they changed it or not, but yeah.
Okay. Anyway, it says the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans recommend an intake of fiber of 14 grams per 1,000 calories each day. But of course, the majority of Americans fall far below this goal. In fact, it's almost comical. Every year, right, I do a little diet recall with students. It's one of the projects that they do in class, and it's usually underclassmen, and they're eating like 9 grams of fiber. I mean, it's almost like, how do you even get it that low? You know, because of their reliance on sort of processed foods and things like that. It's often very low. Anyway, most Americans are, of course, below the fiber recommendations. It says the FDA accepted physiologic health benefits from fiber are the following. Attenuation of blood glucose and insulin, right? So we don't have those blood sugar spikes, as it were. Lower fasting cholesterol. Increased mineral absorption. And I find this interesting because that's sort of loaded, because I think that depends on the type of fiber. Like phytates, for example, in whole grains, they can interfere with certain minerals. But in any case, what else do we have here? Reduced energy intake, right, because they're essentially calorie-free in a sense, right? They're non-digestible, these fibers. And then production of fermentative end products and changes in the GI microbiota. But those, this paper says, are not currently considered physiologic endpoints for fiber. They sort of jump to some of the, the outcomes, in a sense. So I think this paper is calling for a closer look at things like the short-chain fatty acids and what comes out, at the end of consuming these kinds of fibers. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, different kinds of fibers, different kinds of benefits, and I think that's going to interest a lot of athletes as far as their body composition, maybe performance, and all that sort of thing. I don't know. Dr. Campbell, any comments on that? Types of fiber?
I think it's great. It coincides with some, things that I was thinking about prior to this discussion in terms of, things to recommend for health and how we wanted to define the difference between a pre and a probiotic. And it seems that most of those recommendations for the FDA come in the form of the prebiotic. So what you're going to feed your microbiota, as opposed to a probiotic, which is actual, microbes that you're intaking. So I think it's great because while probiotics haven't been found to be, say, detrimental to health, I'm definitely a fan of the prebiotics. So using food to feed those microbes and give them the things they need in terms of those carbohydrates, enhancing the production of those short-chain fatty acids are typically what is associated with all of those health benefits, and I think is of interest to the athlete who really wants to stay healthy, because if you stay healthy, you can train, and if you train, you can enhance your performance. And so I think that that's a big positive message that's coming from that paper, not just from a health perspective, but potentially for say chronic diseases, but a health perspective for the general population.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I looked at the full manuscript. It is a sweeping review, right? So I'm trying to cherry pick a few things and still make sense out of it, and that people might actually be interested in, because there's a lot of mechanistic things, of course, in that paper. But
right.
Okay. Well, let's switch gears a little bit, though, and let's just talk about you. We always like to do the origin story segment here, so let's just share with listeners how you got into exercise physiology and eventually, studying poo, right?
Yeah.
That's something it's a little bit less unusual, I think, than it used to be, but it still sounds a little unusual. But let's start with either academically or athletically. How did you become who you are?
Right. Well, thanks for asking. And I started playing soccer when I was 5. And so I got really excited about that sport. I was involved in other sports as well. I gave a try to softball. I did swimming. But really, when it came time to finish up middle school and go into high school, I really got into just focusing on soccer as my primary sport and played that pretty much year round. And so when it came time to look at colleges, I knew that I wanted to go play soccer in college. So you talk to coaches, you get recruited, and one of the biggest messages that I remember getting was, gosh forbid you have a career-ending injury, what type of university would you want to go to that had a great academic program and was a place you really enjoyed being? Mm-hmm. And so in looking at all of the universities, I chose Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania. It was just a beautiful campus. It still is. I got to go back there last year. The soccer program was outstanding. We were Division II, but we were, my senior year, top 5 in the country. We went to nationals 3 out of the 4 years I was there. We're conference champions. And I actually went initially for physical therapy. Like probably most of you are familiar with, many of the students who come through our exercise science programs are usually interested in physical therapy. After some not so fun chemistry classes initially, I was like, oh, I'm not sure if more chemistry is in my future. And I started looking at majors, and someone was like, well, there's a major called exercise science. And I was like, wow, science, we're all science nerds, admittedly. And I was like, a science in studying exercise. So as an athlete, it really doesn't get any better than hearing that there's a major about how exercise or what exercise does to your body. So I pretty much that day I went to the registrar and changed my major. And, in some ways the rest became history. I found a phenomenal female mentor, Dr. Linda Lemira, my junior year. And so that was a great decision. And she, helped me get an internship at the U.S. Olympic Training Center up in Lake Placid, New York, where I primarily worked with the women's ice hockey team. And for the longest time, I had some interest in that, but I also had interest in looking at heart disease. I had a grandmother who passed away really young from heart disease, and that became kind of my stepping stone to start looking into PhD programs where they had strong, cardiovascular programs. Ended up going to work with Dr. Bob Moffitt down at Florida State University, and looked at cholesterol metabolism and how exercise affects the cholesterol profile. So specifically, total cholesterol, HDLs and their subfractions, LDL, the small LDL, lipoprotein little a, and continued with that through my postdoctoral fellowship, which was also at Florida State under the direction of Dr. Bahram Arjmandi. But it was nutritionally focused. So we looked at flaxseed and how it might reverse atherosclerotic lesions in an animal model of ovarectomy. And so from there, I got lots of training in heart disease, inflammation, lumens of vessels. And so when I applied to come work at Rutgers, because I'm a Jersey girl at heart, my family is back here, I came with the interest of continuing potentially to look at some of that inflammation. And through kind of like a very profound conversation I had with a colleague, is like, what can you contribute as a scientist? And so I spoke to, another colleague of mine who I met during my postdoc, and, just asked about the bioavailability of antioxidants in obesity. And I said, I'm interested in inflammation. Inflammation is linked to obesity. And so, antioxidants is one way to help reduce potentially inflammatory load. So has anyone ever looked at bioavailability of antioxidants in obesity? And he was like, I don't think so. Start doing some searches. And really that's where everything changed, because I started looking at bioavailability, nutrients, gut, obesity. And that's when I started seeing some of the first papers on nutrition, obesity, and gut microbiome. And so I started reading some of those and got very excited. And the next search I performed was exercise and microbiome, and it said 0. So that was my calling.
Wow.
And so from there, I started designing some of the first animal studies that we were conducting at the time, because we wanted to look a little bit more at mechanism. We take actually intestinal sections, which is a little bit more difficult to do in humans. I mean, if you know anybody who's willing to give me a section of their gut, great, but I don't usually think that that's something we can do.
Not okay.
But, I've started to work with some physicians who can do biopsies and so forth. So that's going to be, a way to start looking at some inflammatory markers in colon tissue, for example. But that's really, it started all with, being excited about exercise as a soccer player, and then finding just some great mentors along the way who helped facilitate that love of science, and really a search that ended in a 0 count at exercise and microbiome. And so from there, we just started asking lots of questions about how exercise might change the microbiota, because we know that exercise changes metabolism and that the microbes are linked to metabolism. So I thought, okay, well, that might be an interesting place to start. And so that's really where it all began. And I'm sure that sounds a little crazy, but that's really how it all started. And now, you talk about poo. I mean, the kids call us the poo crew or the poo group, and
Right.
we're kind of just known as the people who investigate what happens to your fecal samples when you exercise, which I'm all good with that.
Right. No, absolutely. I think it's interesting how people, there's like multiple branches in the career path, and you increasingly move more and more in a direction until you're up to your elbows in poo.
Right. Pretty much. Pretty much.
I used to make fun of a friend of mine, Steve. He works down at Abbott Labs in Columbus, and he was one of the first guys. I mean, gosh, in the early 90s, he was publishing some stuff on, because he was interested in lactose maldigestion, right? And so
Right.
he was taking gas samples after having people wear rubber pants with valves and whatnot, and I used to kind of, laugh at him like, how do you become a flatulence researcher,
Right.
because it's not something that immediately, like, you don't just wake up one day and be like, that's me, I'm all about that. But like you said, it's this seductive, like this lure toward, I'm interested in inflammation, and oh man, the gut microbiome plays a huge role in this. And
Right.
And over the past couple of years on the podcast here, we've talked about things like the biggest trends. One of our biggest trends has been the gut microbiome, and how individual bugs or their metabolites or what have you, what they do with the foods that you consume, how they can affect performance or body comp or all these different things. And so that's what we're going to get to after the break. But let me just dig into one thing you said about your career. You said you worked you said ice hockey?
Yeah, the women's ice hockey team. Yep. I got to train them I got to meet a bunch of the teams up there, but specifically at the time they were getting ready. So this was in 2001. So they were getting ready to defend their gold medal in the 2002 Olympic Games.
Oh, wow. Okay. What did you do with them? I mean, what was your role?
Right. So as the exercise physiology intern, I guess you could say. So it was my job to really attend and lead their training sessions, work with them on mainly cardiovascular fitness. The strength and conditioning coach worked with that aspect, the strength training, but the cardiovascular fitness really kind of fell on my shoulders as I interacted with the PI at the training center at the time. So I got to go watch them on ice, and we tested, believe it or not, we actually tested some air quality up there in Lake Placid because some of them had exercise-induced bronchospasm because of the cold weather. So we had to take that into consideration when you were training those athletes. So it was a pretty surreal and awesome experience working with those, they were the top players in the world.
Right.
They ended up, I think in 2002, I think they did won the silver medal that year.
Okay.
But 98, they did the gold in 2002. But it was just an awesome time meeting and working with those women.
Sort of a cool addition to your portfolio, right? That you worked with a silver medal winning team.
Definitely, for sure. Yeah.
Part of the reason I asked what you did specifically is because you had brought up some of the nutrition stuff. And I think our listeners realize, but a lot of the data, a lot of the research that comes out in nutrition is actually done by exercise physiologists, especially the kind of nutrition that's interesting to our listenership, right?
Right.
It's not
Right.
like dietitians are generally, right? It's a very small minority that actually have doctorates and do a lot of research, and so they're focused on the clinical side of things often, and you don't see quite as much data compared to someone like exercise physiology. And I think that's why you see departments, like we just renamed our department exercise science and nutrition science, right? Because we're trying to emphasize that, hey, we do a lot of the nutrition side of things too. But anyway, so I was just curious about how much one versus the other you were doing before, and because obviously a lot of what you do now is, I would argue, it's primarily nutritional. So
I mean, yes and no. I mean, we use, so I mean, we always have our animals on an exercise regimen, and a lot of times we use the high-fat diets to really manipulate inflammatory status and to see if exercise can ameliorate some of the things that are induced by a high-fat diet. So we've used both the 45 and a 60% fat. So, one really, consistent thing we find not only in our studies but the literature is that exercise is a great way to curtail body weight gain. Yeah, right? So even those animals on a 60% fat diet, but if they exercise, their weight gain is not as high as their sedentary cohort. Right. And so that's a really, and the inflammatory, particularly the inflammatory status in the colon is really protected by exercise, even in the high-fat diet. It seems that both in the 45 and our 60% high fat. So if they eat a higher fat diet and they exercise, they can protect that colon somewhat from an inflammatory insult.
Right. Yeah. One of the reasons you see a lot of exercise physiologists do nutrition research is because these are two manipulations. These are two kinds of interventions that they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Like if the coin is inflammation, right? Right. High fat, to make it quote unquote worse, and then what does exercise do to that? It kind of goes beyond just population specificity and saying athletes have a less inflammation over time or whatnot. But it's just these things affect your dependent variables, right? Whatever they might be.
And I would agree with your comment that over time, because inflammation and production of, say, reactive oxygen species is actually something required for the body to adapt to that exercise. So I think so many people think inflammation and they automatically think it's evil, it's bad, but there is always the flip side to that, where it then produces a response that your body then learns to tolerate and deal with some of that. And obviously it's different with exercise than it is, say, with a prolonged exposure to a high fat diet, as research has shown. But it's that interesting coin that you're talking about, on the heads and the tail side of what can be good to create an adaptation to prevent an inflammatory insult versus what's going to perpetuate that insult.
There's no doubt, and I don't want to go on a tangent, but I think it's one of the things that confuses the hell out of a bunch of lifters and athletes is, like, should I take antioxidants? Are they going to blunt? We've talked about research blurbs over the years about how too much antioxidant activity leads to reduced adaptations to exercise. Like you said, then there are other things, like whether it's your bowel or the intima of your arteries or whatever, then inflammation is something you also want to control. So that the antioxidant and inflammation literature can be such a minefield, I think.
Right.
Okay, we're going to go to break, everybody, and when we come back, Dr. Campbell's going to educate us on just a whole series of questions about, and practical things, about the gut, how to feed it specifically, what you might benefit from by doing so, and that sort of thing. So we'll be back in just a moment. Hey listeners, this is Dr. Lonnie Lowry. If you've ever had anyone critique you on your protein intake as part of your weightlifting lifestyle, oh, you poor meathead, all that extra protein is going to rot your kidneys or weaken your bones or dehydrate you or give you gout or who knows what. There is a book available. You could simply Google CRC Press and Lowry. And what I've done is reach out to experts all over the world and create a book, a single compendium that you can hold up and say, this is why I consume extra protein. This can be very valuable when you're being quote-unquote educated by various professionals on the topic. There's an enormous amount of literature in this book on the safety, the effectiveness, how protein works in cells, the history of protein and weight trainers, much more. So again, please check out CRC Press and Protein and Lowry. You can just Google that. And I do, full disclosure, I do make a small single-digit royalty on the book. But that's not why I did it. I did it so we can all have something, our particular population, to both defend what we do and to inform our nutrition and our eating. Thanks. IronRadio is, of course, primarily a podcast. But over the years, there have been technical glitches calling for backup streaming and listeners who wanted the convenience of other sources of audio content. Toward this end, IronRadio is now simulcast and backed up on YouTube. If needed, please search Lawnman07 or IronRadio from within YouTube. There's not much video, but if you like to listen through YouTube on a Roku or other living room device, there you go.
Like your weekly fix of Iron Radio? In addition to being a popular institute on iTunes, we are also on email. Simply go to www.ironradio.org and sign up for the voluntary email. You'll get a once per week email, no more, that's little more than the show notes and a link to the audio. So go for it.
All right, folks, we're back. It's Phil and Mike and Lonnie, and we have Dr. Sara Campbell with us, and we're going to learn about the gut, how to feed it, what it might do for lifters, right, and exercisers. I think we really need to start with some definitions. We've already touched on a few of these between the news blurb and what Sara was saying earlier, but let's do this in a quick-fire kind of way. Because I know that scientists are always full of caveats, right? Like, well, only in this situation, and only this, and so right. Let's do this as quickly as we can so we can get to the gold nuggets, if you will.
Sure.
Let's just start with microbiome. When you say microbiome, what do you mean?
Right. So microbiome, and there's also microbiota. So they're a lot of times used interchangeably, but microbiome is really the collection of like the genomes, so like the DNA, the genetic potential of the microorganisms within an environment. So we have microbiomes not only for the gut, but for the lungs. There's vaginal microbiomes, so anything, nasal microbiomes, oral microbiomes, so lots of those kind of like mucus membranous type of surfaces has a unique kind of genetic potential within that environment. Right. Whereas the microbiota is simply the organisms that are in that environment. Slight nuance, right?
Right, it is, but I think it's important to note that the way that you identify all those bugs is you don't count them individually. You kind of get an idea of what kind of genetic material is there, and that's the fingerprint, right?
Yes, absolutely. So you get, so the idea of the sequencing platforms that you use, depending on which one you use, it gives you a specific number of base pairs. That base pair is then matched up against known microbial sequences in a NCBI, what we call BLAST. And so it becomes quite time-consuming so that then you can report what those are. Right.
Gotcha. Yeah, in fact, in the past, we even talked about, there was an interesting news release a couple of years ago on the beard microbiota, right? And literally the bugs in your beard, and they were kind of emphasizing, because a lot of our lifters are, this is so stereotypical, but we have a lot of women that listen too, but we have a lot of like bearded powerlifter guys, and it's interesting to note that it might help you resist certain infections, or, they're really, sort of working with you there.
Right. The skin has a very interesting microbiome that I think is really starting to come to the surface, and there are lots of calls for proposals that are looking at that skin microbiome and exactly what you're just talking about, how that might promote, say, resistance to some of the more pathogenic bacteria, to kind of, again, the idea is really with all of these microbiomes is how to optimize it so that that environment is more healthy than it is unhealthy.
Right. And I'll be honest, when I've tried to read some of this literature, it gets so complex with the different populations and so many different kinds that unless you're really willing to sit down and throw a lot of time into this, it can really become difficult to try to extract practical gold nuggets about these sorts of things. But I think one of those, Mike, you brought up in the past, which was about, and I'm sure that Sara will agree with this, but about the difference in pre versus probiotics and how that might work. In other words, if you take probiotics, you don't just rewrite your your gut microbiome, right? Or you don't just completely change these bugs. But Sarah, I think it was also you that mentioned you have these sort of I forget the word you use, but these core groups that then talk with the other satellite populations.
Right. So, one of my colleagues here at Rutgers, we have a pretty good set of microbiome researchers. Li-Ping Zhao came up with the idea of what he called a genome interaction group, and essentially that they are kind of clusters of bugs that we believe functionally work similar. So, a lot of those probiotic type bugs are obviously clustered together, which is why probiotics are such a big thing, which I know we'll touch on very briefly, but that's just not the only group that's out there, that there are several other groups, and each having important functions which aren't all elucidated yet. But if you tend to pull, say, one of those groups in a specific direction, it's going to interact or interfere with how the other groups interact with one another. So that's the only reason, or not the only reason, but one of the major reasons that, I'm a bigger proponent of a prebiotic. So eating a food that feeds those microbes as opposed to a probiotic, which are specific microbes, a lot of which are going to be those bifidobacterium and lactobacillus, which are part of one interaction group.
Okay.
And so it's almost like you're ignoring the other ones.
No, right. Now, Mike, I know that you actually, in a practical way, you bring science to the table for certain clients and whatnot, and you'll try to explain. I think in the past you've said something about, like, if you take a probiotic, you're sort of layering on top, right, of the person's salient microbiota kind of thing. How do you do that? Like, literally, really practical brands, doses, that sort of thing. Like, what do you normally consider if someone's interested in a pre or probiotic?
Yeah, usually with that, like I got from my buddy Michael Ruscio, who's been on here before too, is kind of, I usually just use three categories. The main one being kind of the lacto kind of bacillus category, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too, Dr. Campbell. And then other kind of what's called an outcrowder, so like a Saccharomyces boulardii, which is, I think, more of a yeast type spectrum. The truck drives by. And then there's some other like soil-based probiotics, which are probably a little bit newer, although they've been around for a while. And in all honesty, I just kind of guess.
Okay.
Just based on experience of what this, tends to work better. And a lot of it, comes down to logistics. Some of the real high dose, VSL ones, things like that have to be refrigerated. So if you have an athlete that's traveling a lot, they can be out of the refrigerator for a while, but, the potency kind of drops. So sometimes it's just practicality. I may just use the soil-based probiotic to start and see if it helps, because I can use a lower dose and they don't have to be refrigerated, things of that nature. I usually find those tend to be just tolerated pretty well, like they don't tend to mess up digestion, things of that nature. But yeah, any input you have on that, I'd be more than willing to hear it, because you're not really dealing with the frank pathology. You're dealing with a little bit of, this is kind of bugging me. Maybe this is what it is. So you're definitely in that gray area-ish.
Good point. Yeah.
Right. And so I think what you said is not only just interesting, but a little bit true when you said, I just kind of guess, because I would almost argue, if even out of the four of us, and I study the microbiome, I couldn't tell you, I have not actually done a sample of myself. Could any of you tell me what your microbiome looked like?
Not at all.
Yeah, and that was one of my questions too, about at some point just the at-home testing for the microbiome, which the little bit I know is like, yeah, you might as well keep guessing.
Right. Well, I think they're getting better with some of that. I think that some of the collection kits have a longer shelf life. It all depends on, I think the Human Microbiome Project is still really big, place for kind of accepting some of those samples. I actually think a lot of the companies who provide the kits for a fee will actually provide you with a readout, your bioinformatics of what your microbiome looks like. And so, the big things to consider from a scientific point of view is, which platform do they use to analyze? So we were talking, Lonnie, you were talking earlier about how starting to read some of that information can get quite cumbersome, and it can. But it's all about at which level of taxonomy do they explain things. So taxonomy being like kingdom all the way down to species and strain. And many of the platforms can only get to usually family or genus. And then they have to use some sort of algorithm, for lack of a better word, to determine some of those species and or strains. So the longer the read, aka more base pairs that you can establish with your technology, the more specific you can get at looking at those species and strains. And so I think that that's one interesting thing when we think about probiotics, is that some of the technologies that are out there right now don't necessarily get down to that nitty-gritty level that might be able to tell you which ones are the actual best, probiotics to actually take. And there's also just the limitation of the mechanisms by which the microbes work. And I think that that's really what becomes important. I think people throw around terms like, oh, we need to enhance microbial diversity, so the more different types of microbes you have, the better or the healthier you'll be. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, the literature supports that, a more diverse microbiome, might be associated with better health, but we don't know how those microbes function. And so the function of those microbes really are what is what gonna dictate what metabolites they produce.
Okay,
so that was one of the things that you wanted me to answer, right? What are these metabolites and what are these short chain fatty acids, mm-hmm. right? And so is that all right if I kind of get into some of that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if we could talk about terms like fermentation, short chain fatty acids, the whole deal, right? Which is, I think, where you're headed.
Right. So some of the questions were, what's a non-digestible carb? What's a fermentable carb? Short-chain fatty acids. I mean, a lot of those terms are used so interchangeably. I mean, in nutrition world, you can talk about, a resistant starch or a soluble fiber versus an insoluble fiber, right? I think those are the types of things that you're really talking about. So, soluble fiber, resistant starch is basically something that's resistant to digestion in the small intestine. It's going to really stay relatively intact until it gets down to the colon, where it, is acted upon by the microbes. And this is that fermentation process. And so those complex carbohydrates then become essentially short-chain fatty acids. And the three primary short-chain fatty acids that we hear most about are acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Mm-hmm. And so, the slight nuance and differences is an insoluble fiber, which is really what we think about that helps to promote BMs, right? So somebody who's constipated, you tend to prescribe or promote them taking in insoluble fibers. Soluble fibers are many of the things, Lonnie, that you spoke about at the beginning in terms of recommendations from the FDA. Mm-hmm. And so those are those resistant starches. And these carbohydrates, again, are critical to promoting a healthy microbiota.
Can you label as good or bad, beneficial or not, any of those short-chain fatty acids? Like, does someone want more acetate in their bloodstream, or is that generally deleterious? Or propionate or butyrate? Are some of these better to have more in your system than others? I know this is grossly simplifying stuff, but...
No, you can put some judgments on them.
Okay.
Like, the overwhelming consensus with the exercise literature is that it does absolutely promote butyrate production, and that's good.
Okay.
Butyrate, as a short-chain fatty acid, promotes colonocyte, so a colon cell health. It promotes how they develop, how they differentiate, how they function as a healthy cell within that colon, to reduce the amount of potentially inflammatory insult that colon might experience. Mm-hmm. So in some ways that's excellent. So it's not an oversimplified question at all. I mean, exercise is known to do that. And exercise is a known preventative for things like colon cancers and inflammation, and recommended for inflammatory bowel disease patients and so forth. So I think that that's an excellent question, and something that the literature has just, recently over the last couple of years, I'd say since 2016, we published that paper in PLOS in the animal model showing butyrate producing microbes were higher when animals are exposed to exercise. And it's been validated over the last couple of years in additional animal studies and in human studies as well.
Okay. Part of the reason that I ask is because about a year ago we talked about a paper that was suggesting that acetate production and then presumably blood concentrations affected your brain in such a way that it caused like fogginess and fatigue.
Right.
And to me that sounds like a negative, right?
Right. So on the health side, there's an animal study where they actually directly infused acetate into the brain, and it increased what they call hyperphagia. It basically made them eat a lot more and induced type 2 diabetes. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily always the case, right? I think that that's kind of the complicated part to the question you're asking. Mm-hmm. Butyrate exercise relationship seems to be pretty well established. The propionate tends to also be one of the more favorable short chain fatty acids in terms of health promoting. Acetate tends to be really dependent upon really the intervention. In the one case we saw acetate, induce type 2 diabetes. And another case, a paper by my one colleague who I was just saying in 2018 showed that acetate, as a result of his diet, which was high in prebiotic carbohydrates, was consistently higher in some of the healthier patients. So I think this is where function becomes really important, right? Because it could be the function of a pathogenic bug producing acetate has a deleterious effect, where the production of acetate, say, from a more beneficial bacteria will then downstream affect metabolism in a healthier way. Right. So I think that that's why we can't get so hung up sometimes on diversity without addressing the fact that those microbes function in specific ways becomes critically important to that conversation.
Right. Yeah. I guess that's why I'm tiptoeing, because being largely ignorant of this area, right, aside from what you're saying is on the dietetic side of it, which is more simplified, about judging these things as good or bad, these specific, short chain fats and whatnot. But
I mean, I feel ignorant too most of the time. There's a lot of information out there on the microbiota, the microbiome. It is a rapidly expanding topic, and to say that or anyone could keep up with the amount of information that comes out is a little naive. I mean, I would never, claim to do that. I mean, I try and stay in my wheelhouse as best I can and think about things, but, knowledge is, those papers are just abundant and everywhere.
Right. Yeah. It's easy to get bogged down in mechanistic stuff. Mike and I will talk about that sometimes, not knowing that is there an actual clinical outcome to be had,
Right. Right.
Okay, so let's try to cut to the chase the best we can here.
Sure.
So from this perspective of colonic microbiota, what kind of foods would you suggest are most beneficial? I mean, whether it's body composition or performance. And trying to keep in mind, right, we have a lot of, lifters that listen to this show, and they're going to be probably more interested in strength than they are cardiovascular stuff. But
right.
Foods, doses, any kind of recommendations that you feel like you could at least speculate on?
Sure. So obviously one of the big things that is consistently true with a healthy microbiota that's anti-inflammatory are going to be those prebiotic type of foods that, like I said, you were reading off and recommending earlier in terms of the FDA. So those types of things like oats and beans and fruits and barley and psyllium, those are going to be those healthy promoting carbohydrates. You hate to be, here's me being, oversimplified, but the kind of like good versus bad carbohydrate, right? So the good carbohydrate, those starches, versus the bad carbohydrate, the ones that produce a rapid rise in that glucose and insulin. You want that more sustained response that actually, in terms of the gut, helps promote a healthy, we're gonna go there, mucus layer that continuously feeds those microbes and protects that colon from inflammation. And so in terms of carbohydrates, that's really the things to look out for. Dosing is hard, I would say, just because it's a little individualized, right? It depends on what phase you are, say, in your training. If you're, say, a bodybuilder and closer to show, my guess is you're trying to cut out as many carbs as possible, right? And so I would argue some of the carbs that you need to get are some of those starchier type of carbs to at least try and help not to break down that barrier in the gut. Or, the microbiota is pretty resilient. If it's changed temporarily, it will, because of, say, a diet or a cut or something like that, it will actually, once you kind of go off of that, resume its normal function and diversity to what it was when it was before, right? So your microbiome is settled, believe it or not, when you're young, around 2 or 3, and it takes about, so in terms of timing, it takes a couple of weeks to actually really kind of functionally change the composition of the microbiota. It's suggested about 28 days, so 4 weeks.
There you go. Okay.
And so, yep. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that physiologically you won't start seeing things, all right? The microbiota will start to shift. Well, I should say that. So the microbiota will start to shift, and then you will start to see physiological changes. So the microbiota actually changes before the physiological outcome. So that's a really interesting thing that links the microbiome composition to the health and the function of the host.
Okay, now
right?
Let me ask you something, and this is asking you to speculate, because I sincerely doubt there are studies on this. But
sure,
it's when you mentioned like bodybuilder dieting for a competition, that kind of thing, and when you talk about the particular microbiota and how they affect hunger, or and how acetate might worsen that hyperphagia and that excessive eating.
Right.
If someone was about to start a pretty aggressive stepwise diet, let's say a 20-week diet where they're pulling out carbohydrates more and more over this period or what have you,
right,
would it behoove them for, let's say, a month to eat a lot of these whole foods, these higher fiber foods? Would they have more of a chance not to fall off the wagon?
That's a great question. Something we should design as a study. I'm just saying.
Okay.
Would it prevent the change? It's possible. It's possible that if they built up a particular beneficial microbiota because they really kind of promoted those good bugs, it's possible that it might take longer to change once you go through that kind of total switch right before, say, your show. But that's totally speculative,
right,
as you mentioned. There's definitely no data out there to say that.
Right.
But it's possible that I could see those microbes being a little bit more, stable, for lack of a better word, and kind of holding true to those genome groups that kind of interact then with the other ones.
Right. Okay, part of the reason I ask that is because, at least me personally, and maybe listeners, those of you who have done bodybuilding diets in the past, you could chime in on this, but mid-diet, so I would usually, when I was competing, I would do like a 20 or a 24-week diet. It was sort of progressive, but mid-diet, I always felt like, I'm not that hungry. Like, I don't want to go wipe out a bag of greasy chips right now. I don't want to go eat 3 or 4 candy bars. Like, I kind of you get in this, Mike Mentzer, right, a famous pro bodybuilder from the golden era, he used to call it metabolic momentum. And I think it's interesting that the gut microbiome may actually be explaining some of that. Maybe there is something to his concept, right, which was really just opinion on his part. We're talking about decades ago. this idea of metabolic momentum and how you kind of just get in this state where, it's not that hard to maintain it. Maybe it's not just psychological. Maybe it's that gut influence on your brain.
Right. And there's an enormous gut influence on your brain. I mean, the gut and the brain are connected via the vagus. So, there's a reason they say, I have a gut feeling, or go with your gut. And, it's very interesting that these things have developed given now all that we know about that, brain gut axis and that type of communication that goes on. So, there's a real sound way you can kind of talk through that to make it, almost sound sensible.
Right. Okay. Now we're running out of time, so let me wind this down a little bit with a question that I asked you when we were in Vegas, which is, what's the effectiveness of this approach that you're so fascinated with? Right. What's its contribution compared to something like hormones or drugs or the other kinds of things that come into gym conversations with powerlifters and bodybuilders? What's the potency of what you're talking about here when it comes to body comp or performance?
Right. So what's really interesting is since we had a chance to talk in Las Vegas, I've initiated a collaboration with a really cool microbiologist in Iowa, and he actually studies the production of a lot of those things that you're kind of mentioning, dopamine, the neurotransmitters, like a neuroendocrine metabolic profile. And so I think that that's where that's headed to. So what types of these bugs can, say, enhance dopamine production or epinephrine or norepinephrine production that's linked to activating fat metabolism and happy feelings in the brain? And so what bugs really do that, produce a lot of those neurotransmitters? And so we, have started taking a special media that my collaborators developed and incubating fecal samples with it to find out which some of those bugs might be. And that might be an interesting direction in terms of a probiotic. So incorporating some of those bugs that enhance production of some of those neurotransmitters, which might be linked to, say, norepinephrine to facilitate lipolysis, right? Or dopamine to kind of give you enhanced feelings of mental health and mental well-being. And so I think that that's kind of the best answer that I have for that question, but a really cool area that people should really be on the lookout to see what those microbes might be producing and how they then get incorporated into some of those probiotic potentially formulations.
Okay, right. No, so in a sense, what I'm taking from that is it might essentially be a false distinction to say gut microbiome versus hormones, because maybe their influence on hormones, and I mean, even beyond neurotransmitters, GLP-1 and insulin and ghrelin, I mean, you can go down the list, maybe they're part of the same puzzle, right? In that, in fact, the bugs are altering concentrations of these things,
right,
and that sort of thing, so.
Yeah. So it's possible, right, that, finding ways to enhance your body's natural way to produce them rather than a synthetic way might be just healthier, for lack of a better word, so just using your body to facilitate that production. And so, I mean, there's at least 12 to 15% of the metabolites that are circulating in the blood that are derived from your microbes.
Oh, wow, that's juicy. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
And so just to quickly get back, because I know you asked me something earlier, and I did find it. So in 2014, there was a study done on rugby players, right? And so rugby would, in my mind, be, closer to some of the potentially like bodybuilding, weightlifting type athletes, right? Strength and power oriented, right? And so, I had a chance to look at the diet intake of those participants. And so, in terms of proteins, in terms of grams per kilogram body weight, they were about 2.36 or 2.4 grams per kilogram, and got up around, 39 grams of fiber. And so I think that, with the higher protein, they were still able to balance some of that fiber. And this was one of the first human studies that came out to show that those athletes had, better microbes better health-related outcomes, and it's going to be a balance of ensuring that you get enough protein to enhance, the muscle building that you want as a strength athlete, but keeping that fiber so that you can have the microbiome that you hope that will be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. It's funny to go back and look at traditional bodybuilding type diets, and it's often like a chicken breast or two on a plate, but then half your plate is broccoli or green beans or something that's going to be fibrous in a sense,
right?
Right. Or a yam,
right,
for the starch source and that sort of thing, and it's almost like validating a little bit, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah, and so that's that's a great thing in terms of not only just meeting your training needs, but also maintaining gut health, which is important in more ways than one.
Oh, it is. And Mike brought something up earlier that I think as we sort of close here is that paper that I was just looking at, that review paper about focusing on the production of short chain fatty acids and that sort of thing, and what are the end products and the outcomes of changing your microbiota and all that. It actually critiqued that a lot of the research that the FDA has leaned on over the years is in healthy populations, and it's not in people that are in a chronically inflamed state, like you're talking about obesity or cardiovascular disease or and some of that kind of stuff. Population specificity, that's a thing, and
right.
We have to think about that. If we're basing so much of it only on healthy people, maybe we need different fiber recommendations based on disease type. Like a type 2 diabetic should be eating these, versus
right.
a healthy person kind of thing.
Right. I mean, that's where initially my search started was, with, bioavailability in obesity. If to combat that inflammatory status, is there a greater need for antioxidant-rich foods?
Yep. I have a lot of other questions, too, that I won't bore you or listeners with. Like I did my dissertation, actually, on different fatty acids and their effect on systemic inflammation. And
nice.
So when you talk about high-fat diets and that sort of thing, the first thing that comes to mind is if you're using that as a tool to inflame rodents, then I would think that those are mostly omega-6 fatty acids or, saturated fats and omega-6.
Yes.
Like there's probably not a lot of omega-3s in that little blend in the rat chow or whatever.
Right. Right.
So.
Right. So, yeah, that's true. That's true. It does depend on the type of fat. I mean, we know that the Mediterranean diet, which is one of the ones now promoted, right, by the dietary guidelines, is higher in the mono and polyunsaturated fats. And the microbiome literature suggests that they have a healthy microbiome. So it is, the type of fat does definitely play a role in that.
Right on. Okay. Well, I know that was a lot, so thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. It's always fun talking about poop first thing in the morning.
It is. Well, I think our listeners know. I mean, Mike and I will go off. I mean, you ask a professor to talk about her or his interest, and look out, because, there's going to be lots of chatting going on.
Right. Hopefully it was all good chatting.
I think it was.
Oh, that's very good.
All right. Well, I know Phil had to jet, so everyone, we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Hey, listeners, have you seen the store at IronRadio.org? There are 3 halls in the store. One for Phil, one for Fortress, and one for myself, Dr. Lowry, and they're thematic. So you can go into our Halls of Iron store and choose based on your goal. If you need something to learn or read or something nutritional, you can look in my store, Lonnie's store. If you want something about injury prevention or competition, then take a look at Phil's Hall of Iron. And if you want something about motivation or daily training, Fortress's Hall has what you're looking for. There are some fun, heroic descriptors as you browse through the stores. We try to make it a little more fun than the average boring online store. And whether you're a novice lifter or someone more experienced, you can take heart that you're not wasting your time. The things that we put in each Hall of Iron are actually based on our own recommendations. Protein powders that we know to be good, knee sleeves, wraps of some kind, things that Fortress uses in his own training. The stuff you see, is good. This way you don't waste time. So check out the Iron Radio store at ironradio.org And let us know what you think on the forums, and certainly you can request products and we will screen them before they go in. So, thanks for listening. Iron Radio is accepting donations. If you like what we do, the professors, the scientists, the bodybuilding show promoters, the athletes themselves in powerlifting and bodybuilding, please consider making a donation or maybe buying something from the IronRadio.org store. We also are accepting supporting members. So for $4 a month, which is frankly less than the bank sneaks out of your account in fees, you can step up and support a form of sort of public radio for the bodybuilding and powerlifting and strength community. The Iron Radio podcast and all of the audio on ironradio.org is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, it's important to check with your physician. Also seek the help of registered dietitians, athletic trainers, and qualified exercise physiologists in order to make the progress that you need.